as part of its global campaign on the right to protest, Article 19 has published a report on the situation in Poland. You will find the link to the report in the chat section. And I also encourage everyone to write questions. There will be time at the end to have a Q&A session. Since 2015, the Law and Justice Party in Poland has been actively working to limit the space for public participation in Poland. They have begun to dismantle the rule of law, used state media to intimidate activists, targeted the LGBTIQ community, restricted abortion rights, and put limits on freedom of expression and assembly more broadly. These actions to dismantle democratic institutions and weaken citizens' rights have sparked a powerful resistance movement, the largest since the Solidarity movement in the 80s, known worldwide. And these anti-government protests have mobilized around three main issues: the politicization of the judiciary, reproductive rights, and discrimination against LGBTIQ people. And while people have started to engage more in affairs that affect their community, establish support networks, and learn how to conduct activist campaigns, the state has begun to use force more frequently to disperse demonstrations. There have been reports of people being pushed to the ground, unlawfully taken into custody, or even intimidated further after the end of protests. Please welcome our speakers, Anna Wójcik, co-founder and editor of Rule of Law in Poland and the Wiktor Osiatyński Archive, which is a rule of law monitoring project. Anna is also an assistant professor at the Institute of Legal Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Karolina Gierdal, an attorney, member of the Bar Association in Warsaw and the Human Rights section of the District Bar Council in Warsaw. Since 2020, Karolina has been a member of anti-repression collective Szpila, providing legal help to people detained during protests and to activists facing criminal charges for their work. Joanna Gzyra-Iskandar, human rights activist, organizer, and participant of a number of protests, who has been facing different levels of state repression for her work, including lawsuits. And Quinn McKew, executive director of Article 19, Global Freedom of Expression organization. I would like to start with a question to you, Quinn. Poland is one of the countries chosen by Article 19 for its global campaign on the right to protest. Can you tell us about the global campaign and what challenges do you see for the right to protest that we face today worldwide?
Excuse me. Sure. Thank you so much, Joanna, for inviting me to join this panel and to be speaking with such distinguished co-panelists. I think where we need to start is looking more broadly at what's happening in the world. Over the past 10 years, we've seen an increase in the global protest. And this is directly tied to an increasing sense of inequality, an increasing sense of disparity between the haves and have-nots, and an increasing crackdown by governments on the right to speak, the right to hear, democratic processes in general. Over the past 15 years, we've seen a tripling of social movements that have taken to the street that are using protest as a way of trying to achieve their rights. And usually when people go to the street or go online and try organizing, it's because there are not sufficient avenues elsewhere for them to feel they can get their complaints redressed. So we have this global space where increasingly people are upset. They feel that their voices have no avenue, and so they're taking to protest movements. They're starting them up. They're trying to find ways of expressing and pushing for change. And that's kind of the global space that we have. But power doesn't give up. Power pushes back. And so what we have seen globally are a number of ways that power, authorities, both in democracies, in weak democracies, strong democracies, and in authoritarian or authoritarian-leaning countries, they've sought to limit the ability of citizens to actually push back, to dissent, to challenge, because power doesn't like to be challenged. You know, one of the key ways that we saw this was during the COVID pandemic. 2/3 of countries in the world used the pandemic to criminalize some form of public march, some form of public participation. And a lot of those laws that have been passed under emergency legislation have not been rolled back. They're still on the books and are still being used as emergency powers to restrict protest. And some of the other things that we have seen in the world are that led us to say, we need to start a protest campaign. We need to actually try and protect this right to keep it from being eroded. We've seen increased stigmatization, the othering of those who are calling for their rights, saying that they're not one of us, there's something else, they need to be set aside, these are the bad people. We see that stigmatization particularly because it's usually groups that have been marginalized or discriminated against in society that often are taking to protests. LGBTI, religious minorities, sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, racial minorities. During protests themselves, we see unjust detention, mass roundups of individuals, people who are incarcerated or detained. We also see increasing use of force and police brutality. And again, this is globally, we see this in many places around the world. Often the laws that are passed or restrictions that are passed to limit the right to protest are clearly rooted in some form of discrimination. They're used to target groups that are already considered other or not mainstream in society. We see this in the United States, where there were laws that were passed specifically to limit the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen this in the United Kingdom, where laws have been passed to kind of limit those who are calling for a decolonization approach in the United Kingdom or to target climate protesters. And we've seen that in many places around the world in Europe that are particularly trying to limit the right of LGBTQI individuals protesting. And as part of that, we've seen the misuse of legislation, as I've said. You know, the COVID legislation, emergency powers, national security legislation have been used to try and curtail the rights of individuals under international and national law, typically, to have their voices heard. So that's the background, and that's why Article 19 has launched our global campaign to try and push back against these areas where we see protests being eroded, particularly from the avenue of pushing back against the stigmatization and police brutality. And that's where we've been focusing our efforts.
Thank you. Anna, I would like to ask you now, how has the right to protest in Poland been changing in recent years? What kind of restrictions have been introduced and what is concerning about them? I would like to also mention that Anna is a co-author of our report on Poland. So could you also tell us why did you decide to examine especially protests against the near total abortion ban and discrimination against the LGBTIQ community?
Thank you, Anna, for the invitation to draft the report. And I drafted it with my colleagues, Dominika Sitnicka and Anton Ambroziak. We are very happy that the report is out because we feel that it's extremely important. This year we have parliamentary elections this autumn. So this creates this very specific context in which the right to protest needs to be protected as much as possible. And to those of you in the audience who are not that much familiar with the Polish protest culture, maybe I will just simply explain what sort of protests do happen in Poland. And many many of you could have seen on the news images from the protests that took place a month and a half ago in Warsaw and in other big cities in Poland. And these were demonstrations that attracted the biggest crowd since the beginning of transition to democracy, since 34 years now, 500,000 people at least in the streets. And they were protesting against the general non-liberal constitutional turn of the current government. Poland is one of the fastest autocratizing countries in the world, according to many studies, and it is still characterized as a democracy, but a very flawed one. And the reason for that is an attack, systemic attack on the rule of law, but also restriction on many civil liberties, including the right to protest, freedom of expression, and participation in public assemblies. What are the categories of protests that Polish people actually take part in today? So union protests are rare in Poland, but farmers and miners sometimes do protest. And for over 20 years, LGBT equality marches have taken place in the capital, Warsaw, and more recently also in dozens of cities across the country. So this is a new phenomenon. So in some way, we can say that the Polish culture of protest is thriving. We've also seen in recent years spectacular protests in defense of women's rights, especially reproductive rights. And this was a spontaneous response to curbs on the right to have a legal abortion in Poland. Poland is now one of the few countries in Europe. Actually, Poland and Malta have the strictest abortion laws in the European Union. And the laws were already strict, but since the current governing majority took power in 2015, there were attempts backed by non-governmental social movements to introduce more restrictions to legal abortion. And the major civil society protests were a big reaction to that. And in 2016, the protests labeled as the Black protests, because people wore black protesting in the rain in October. They were considered to be successful because they deterred planned restriction of the abortion law in the parliament. However, the government managed to carry on democratic backsliding, which means it took over many institutions, key democratic institutions in Poland, including the Constitutional Tribunal, that is now captured and is basically not doing independent constitutional review, but is just doing what the government would like it to do. And the result was the ruling from October 2020, which eliminated one of the grounds for legal abortion in Poland. And this created this huge social movement that was, I would say, transgenerational, and that attracted people in big cities, in small towns, people who have never, ever participated in any protest or organized it. So that was important. But when I'm explaining all those protests taking place, we may see that, yeah, indeed, Poland is a great democracy. You can express your hatred towards the government. And non-liberal governments often point to the fact that protests take place in their countries. And this is an evidence that these countries are still democracies, right? But the right to protest is not a guarantee that protests will be successful or that protesters will be safe. And in our report, we have highlighted that acceptance of protest is an important mark of healthy democracy. And in recent years, we have seen a general turn against European law standards related to civic and political rights in Poland. And this included an attempt to introduce restrictions to the right to protest in Poland. So in 2016, there was a change in the law on assemblies. The law on assemblies was actually introduced in 2015, and it was changed several months later to introduce a category of cyclical assemblies. These are assemblies that have already occurred in a place, and they have a priority over other former assemblies. And the novelty was also a requirement to have a permit, to ask for a permit to have a legal protest. Of course, this does not apply to spontaneous protests, but anyway, that increased this threshold to organize protest in Poland. And this was specifically introduced to make more secure the right to protest of the government and its supporters over commemorations of a plane crash from 2010, in which almost 100 political and societal figures from Poland were killed. And the government is using these commemorations as a form, as a spectacle, a show of unity, and is using it as a vehicle for attracting more supporters to their cause. So, Joanna, you asked me why we have focused on specific groups of protests, LGBT activists and women's rights activists in our piece. So we have drafted it some time ago already. I know that the report has been a little bit delayed due to the war in Ukraine and all the things that took priority in the world. And back then, we were astonished by how different the approach of authorities and law enforcement is towards organizers and participants of the protests by vulnerable groups and by really spontaneous protests created like literally in the streets. This should be understood in a broader context. So I explained this context of a backlash to achieved levels of gender equality and reproductive rights. And we also have a backlash to an idea of LGBT rights expansion in Poland. So Poland is routinely ranked at the very bottom of ILGA Europe ranking on LGBT rights in Europe. In Poland, we don't have many basic human rights provisions for LGBT people, such as, for instance, we don't have a prohibition of homophobic, transphobic, hate speech in our criminal code, and we don't have any form of legal same-sex unions. I'm not even speaking of marriage. So Poland in this respect is like really, really much less advanced than countries, not only in Western Europe, but also now in Eastern Europe, because we see that in countries such as Slovenia, the Constitutional Court has been all for equal marriage. And now in countries such as Latvia, in the Baltic states, there are also discussions about increasing protections to LGBT people. And Poland is, under our current extremely conservative nationalist government, it's absolutely not going into this direction. So the government has made opposition towards expansion of LGBT rights one of its main ideological engines. And that was especially visible in the string of political campaigns to European Parliament elections, local elections, and general elections, and presidential elections, sorry, not general ones. And at that time, there was a smear campaign against LGBT people conducted by top politicians, including the president, who was campaigning to be re-elected, and also by public media, who are also captured in the sense that they have become the government's propaganda machine. And these powerful media have portrayed LGBT rights supporters and LGBT people themselves as enemies to the state, enemies to Polishness, and enemies to sovereignty of the Polish nation. So in this context, when spontaneous protests broke out in August in relation to the detention of an LGBT activist for her act of vandalism towards a tract that spread homophobic messages in Polish cities, and that, in this broader context, created an atmosphere that was very conducive to this protest erupting. And, you know, Polish police is actually not very violent, typically. So it was shocking to see that the protesters were selected seemingly at random, that there was police brutality towards them, that dozens of people have been put in detention, and that it was a general chaos, and it appeared as something very, very concerning in this context of this broader crackdown on LGBT visibility and rights. In the context of women's rights protests, there have been a number of cases of the Polish police using excessive force, and in some cases, protesters have been beaten, pepper sprayed, or detained without charge. And it also applied to this pepper spraying to journalists and members of parliament who were monitoring the protests, although it could be, accidental, but still it happened. Of course, some of these problems have been here for years. So Poland has had major problems with pretrial detention. This is a mechanism that is abused in Poland in general, and for decades already, human rights bodies have been recommending Poland to stop with it. But in this case, we have something new. So we have this police brutality against groups that were not violent, that participated in legal spontaneous protests, and their major crime was just the fact that they are opponents of this ideological identity line of our authorities in Poland. So Poland has a problem with arbitrary and selective applications of restrictive rules and practices against people who have dissenting or minority opinions or viewpoints. And I think that is the main takeaway from our report. Another problem is the broader rule of law backsliding that impacts so many areas of state and how the state responds to such protests. And I would like to highlight not only the police forces, but also how public media participate in creating this atmosphere of witch hunt for minority groups protesters in Poland. And I will stop here because my time has already passed, and I hope we can have a discussion later.
Thank you, Anna, for this overview of the past turbulent couple of years. Karolina, can you hear us now? There is a problem with the connection. I haven't mentioned this before, that Karolina is actually now defending some activists in Warsaw, so she's during an intervention and she has a connectivity problem, so I think she might join us again in a second. So I will now ask a question to Joanna. As an activist, you are often on the front line, participating and organizing many protests, which led to reprisals from the state apparatus. You were actually also one of the individuals who faced trial for offending religious feelings due to an image of Virgin Mary with a rainbow halo, which gathered significant attention worldwide. I'm sure many people heard of this particular story. I'm sure you can tell us more about your experience. What is it like to be an activist in Poland today? And is going out to protest an act of courage?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well, and thanks to Article 19 for invitation to this webinar. Answering your question, being an activist in Poland today is constant multitasking, I should say, because many of us work or have been working for years on many fronts at once. In defense of democracy, independent courts, women's rights, LGBTQI plus rights, against fascists, against police violence, government policy not taking care about climate changes, etc. And I probably missed something on the way. And at the same time, we must also be specialists in the reporting and organizing assemblies, production of materials, speeches, communication, promotion, contact with media, networking, etc., etc. So this is why I'm speaking about this multitasking. And the first wave of protests since 2019, 15, sorry, was massive and quite peaceful, while over the time the freedom of assembly was increasingly limited, which was clearly visible, for example, in Warsaw, which I'm based in the protests against the Smolensk monthly celebrations. There were and still there is a lot of police aggression against people participating in the protests, trying to intimidate the participants of these protests on political party wish. And the police towards civil society were increasingly aggressive from my point of view, and more brutal. It was not only about eliminating individual activists from being active, but also about causing a chilling effect and intimidating other people participating in protests. If just for going for a peaceful protest, peaceful demonstration, you risk being written off by the police, taken to the police station, detained at the police station, you have trial in court, it all drags on, it takes time, you have to hire lawyers, go to hearings, go to trials. All this costs a lot of resources, energy, time, and disorganizes our lives as activists. So practically every time right now, when we are going to the protest, when we are exposed to the contact with the police, we can expect and we should expect aggression from their side. We know that there were acts of physical, psychological, and also sexual violence addressed to the protesters on police stations. I think that maybe we will speak about specific examples later, but the fact is that we are exposed to this aggression and violence, and I'm sure that it negatively affects many people, many activists, and also some people that maybe just want to be activists, but they may be also exposed for this chilling effect. And of course, we as activists, we have to learn how to deal with this violence and aggression and how to protect ourselves from the police. We have some kind of strategies, protection strategies, like leaving the assemblies in groups, not alone. Recording everything, shouting our name where the police are, when the police is taking us, pulling us from the group, asking MPs to intervene on police stations. Collective Szpila, which is represented here by Karolina, is a great example of this self-organization, because this is the collective which is providing legal support for activists. We have those strategies because I think that there are still a lot of activists that want to be active and want to stand up for human rights, but it's not the way it should work. Let's say this: the state should protect our right to protest, but the reality is completely opposite. Thank you for now.
Thank you so much. Karolina,
Hi.
It works now. So my question to you would be, as a human rights lawyer, you've helped many activists and protesters facing repression from the law enforcement. Can you tell us about the mechanism that you have observed that are used against protesters in recent years?
Hi, everybody. So at first, I'm really sorry for so many interruptions in my on and on coming on. I'm just at the illegal eviction of a squad right now, and I'm trying to provide legal help to people here. So it may also happen that I would have to like turn off myself like immediately. So when it comes to the protests, I would say that the problems with the police is like that they are just obeying orders, and someone has to decide at the top that this is the time that we are repressing the protests. When it comes to, for example, the August of the 7th, when people gathered to protest against homophobic political campaign and transphobic political campaign, that was like a smear campaign, I would say, that was like initiated by the politicians during the elections, the general elections, the presidential elections, and the local elections, I guess, and also the EU parliament elections, where LGBTQI people were used as a kind of a scapegoat, as some kind of a threat to the families. Like the 7th of August was about basically about one of the activists, Margot from Stop Bzdurom Collective, but it was also about protecting her, who heard this day the order for her pre-trial detention for 2 months. It was protecting her, but it was also about protecting LGBTI rights. And we know now that from one of the policemen who testified in one of the cases that there was just an order to just arrest people who had some kind of rainbow emblems, logos on them. And that the police was escalating during the protests because people were protesting peacefully. They were of course screaming. They were not silent. There were a lot of emotions, but the police escalated. And recently we heard the judgment of Polish District Court in Warsaw that said that the police was escalating, and that the police was trying to show their force and that they can do anything to the protesters. And they actually quashed the protests, this peaceful protest, and afterwards started to stop people and round them and send them to the police station. And when people gathered in front of the police station on Wilcza Street, another protest in solidarity with the people inside was quashed again by the police, and more people were stopped and taken to another police stations. So, and what also the protests during the women's strike tell us is that a lot of the times we have seen, and so actually, that the police tactics varied according, and there was not really any reasons for why it should, because the protesters were not behaving in any way that would be in any way different. They were chanting, they were singing, they were dancing, they were screaming. They had the same, transparency. They had the same. They were screaming the same things, but the only thing that changed was the police tactic. And according to us, according to our collective, this was somehow associated with the decision at the top of what should be the tactic for today, whether we should stop people or whether we should not. What is also, so for me, it's all about the decisions and using police as an instrument to actually, get those decisions done. So if somebody decides that we have to quash the protest will be quashed. And the police will disregard any rules, law, or anything if they will be given an order. This is my opinion, but this is how it works actually. And providing legal help to people in this kind of circumstances is of course difficult, but we as a collective relied on solidarity of other people who stayed at the protest who were not detained, who sent us the names of people who were detained, which enabled us to look for them at the police stations, various police stations, because they were never, especially during women's strikes, they were all sent to another police stations outside of Warsaw in order to prevent us from other people from solidarity protests, but also to actually make it more difficult for us to find them and to the lawyers to come there. And what I can say is that we have basically found almost all people who were detained during women's strikes. We have found people, all of the people who were detained during the 7th of August, but only because of the determination of our lawyers who cooperated with us, they actually got access to those people who were detained and whose rights were actually violated during those, not only by being stopped without any reason, not only because of unlawful detention, but also during the detention when a lot of the times the rights were violated, especially during the 7th of August, where the Polish Commission of Human Rights, the committee's torture mechanism, actually stated that this was inhuman and degrading treatment. I'm sorry, and this is actually the signal of Szpila Collective's phone. And because right now people are detained by Inicjatywa Dzikie Karpaty, and 4 people at least were stopped, so I have to pick it up, sorry.
Thank you very much, Karolina, for everything you are doing and for joining us even at such a time. Karolina mentioned one of the things she mentioned was trials and lawsuits. This is what happens afterwards, because we often, what we see also in the media abroad is when the protest takes place, and we hear about detentions, we hear about protesters being beaten by the police, and Poland was well covered when it comes to that. But another part of the story is what happens next. So all forms of repression as a follow-up to being an active protester. So I wanted to come back to you, Joanna, because you've faced a number of such lawsuits, trials, and other forms of intimidation afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. In this current situation in Poland, we as activists, we face those long-term consequences that, like you said, are not transmitted on live by media all the time. And speaking about my experience, I probably had a dozen or 20 or more trials, mainly minor offenses, but also one criminal case. But I was signed up by the police many times more. When the police sign you up during the protest or demonstration, you never know if they will call you for questioning or not, if the case will continue or not. So you have to be also on this, constant standby that anytime they can just take this case against you. So I am in exactly this situation. I still have a few of these topics that have not expired and are still open, so they can still be used against me. And the most spectacular, let's say, this trial was the case of Rainbow Mary. So this was this criminal trial, together with Anna and Ella, my activist friends. We were accused of offending religious feelings by hanging such stickers and posters. I hope you can see it. This is the image of Saint Mary of Częstochowa, which is a very well-known image in Poland, very important for Polish history and culture. But we make some changes. We made some changes in it because this halo was originally golden, and we made it rainbow. So for providing those posters and stickers around that particular church in Płock, we faced those this offending religious feelings case. We chose this particular church in Płock because the priest there used to spread hate speech against LGBTQI plus people, describing that being LGBT person is a sin. I'm really sorry for saying that, but I just want to show you the scale of this hate speech and why we decided that we must react for this. As Anna said at the beginning, in Poland, LGBTQI plus people don't have any legal protection against hate speech based on homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, etc. So after our action, the police entered Ella's house and took her to Płock for questioning. She wasn't detained just because our great attorney also went there from Warsaw and get her out from there. Anna and I, we reported ourselves to the police station by ourselves, and the action took place in 2019, but the trial started 2 years later. Our accusers were this priest, which was spreading this hate speech from Płock. He was represented by Ordo Juris, fundamentalistic organization from Poland, also by Kaja Godek, which is anti-gender, anti-abortion and anti-LGBTQI plus activist from Poland, and the prosecutor's office representing the state. So last year we were legally sentenced not guilty by the court of the second instance, but all of our accusers filed cassations to the Supreme Court. So we are waiting for it to deal with our case. So it's still pending, and we are on this like constant standby because every day this trial may start. We are sure that prosecuting us for this protest and for showing solidarity with a persecuted group of LGBTQI plus people was intended to intimidate us and discouraged us from activism, from standing up for human rights. What is also important that our action in 2019 took place during election campaign to European Parliament. And Kaja Godek, which became one of our accusers, she used our action for her political campaign because she was in this, her campaign was taking place in Płock in this region. So I mentioned that because also Anna said that this year in Poland is very particular because of this parliament elections on autumn. So we are expecting again that this smear and hate campaign against LGBTQI plus people may take place again this year. But coming back to my story, I told you that that we think that the state wanted to discourage us from activism, but it happened differently. We got a lot of support from LGBTQI plus community, for which we are extremely grateful, and that was very heartwarming and powerful. And we were very touched that people were driving to Płock from Warsaw and other cities just to support us during our trials. You know, we were inside of the court building, and we heard them. They were standing outside in, you know, January in the snow, complete madness. But the atmosphere that they created was unbelievable. So thank you guys for that. And also I think that this is our victory, that this symbol of Rainbow Mary became an international symbol of solidarity, support, and unconditional love and care, especially for LGBTQI+ community.
Thank you, Joanna. I'm a fan of the Rainbow Mary, so I think you've created a great symbol. But it's sorry to hear how much of your energy and obviously resources it has taken. It's I think we can say that it is a slap, strategic litigation against public participation. It doesn't have to be only against the journalist and only about defamation. It can be also by using other criminal legislation that can target activists for what they are doing. And unfortunately, we are seeing this in Poland more and more. Quinn, Article 19 is campaigning to ensure that all people, especially those who face discrimination, feel empowered to use their right to protest. What are some of the recommendations that Article 19 developed over the years that would improve the situation with the right to protest?
Thanks, Joanna. I think some of the recommendations that we have are reflective of some of the stories that the other panelists have had in terms of the challenges that they faced in terms of actually realizing the right to protest. The global protest campaign, Free to Protest, has three kind of key areas of action, targeting 4 different groups. The first area of action is looking at journalists and the media, and just broadly, and I'll get into some more details on this, it's about combating stigmatization and humanizing protesters. It's about calling on journalists and the media to not disseminate stigmatizing or othering narratives, and trying to ensure that people can feel, as in what Joanna was just saying, you know, that you don't feel alone, that you can have sense of building community that's there. So that's one of the key things for us, combating the stigmatization. The second area is combating police brutality. You know, looking at the different mechanisms in which police can be trained in terms of de-escalation, whether police actions could be criminalized in some extent in terms of sending the right message about this is the way that you need to police protests, trying to increase the sensitivity of that and bring down the temperature. You know, I think, Anna, you were saying that police violence was actually quite rare in Poland until some of the more recent actions. And we want that to be the case so that there's safe protesting, but not brutal protesting. And then the final area of thrust for the campaign is around trying to reform laws that will actually protect protest and make protests safe for all. And that is really looking at kind of the policymakers and the judiciary in particular. I think we've heard a reason why to target the judiciary from Joanna in particular, in terms of the way that it's being used and misused to continue to curtail the right to protest. So in terms of the judiciary, we're particularly looking to kind of immediately end criminal proceedings against people charged solely for exercising their right to peaceful protest. That's number one. And then ensuring that the victims of police abuse do have access to mechanisms for justice. And then finally, in law, ensuring that any sanctions against protesters are proportionate and any restrictions are necessary in relation to protests. So that gets back to the fundamental concepts of only legitimate restrictions on freedom of expression need to be necessary and proportionate. And that's kind of continuing on that. Other recommendations that we have to lawmakers and to governments are that hasn't really been mentioned yet, but we see in a number of places, is that recognizing that the failure to notify authorities of an intention to assemble and to protest should not make the protest unlawful. We see that as a mechanism, a law that's been put in place in a number of areas around the world, where you have to get a formal kind of certificate or police sanction in order for protests to be considered lawful. But yet there's nothing under international law that actually would require that. And it is a barrier to people actually achieving their rights to expression and also the rights to freedom of association and assembly. So those are some of the things that we particularly look at in terms of governments. And of course, the government, one of our key messages again, is stop the hate speech, stop stigmatizing protests and protesters, and actively act to prevent others from doing so. Stop targeting marginalized and minority communities with the othering rhetoric, the hate speech themselves. That's one of the main things we can do to kind of dial down the anger and the violence that gets directed towards protesters. Now, getting back to journalists in the media, I mentioned we really want to look at them in terms of combating stigmatization. So really calling on them to stop disseminating content that others people, or that would call for the criminalization of protesters, particularly those against marginalized groups, and to really look at condemning such language if it's used by public officials. We want to ensure, again, really encourage diversity within the media, make sure that media staff actually reflect the full diversity of the population and not just particular elites. And that finally, we would look at kind of adopting and promoting high standards of media ethics and guidelines in terms of the coverage on protests based on international standards, and training all media workers on these guidelines. And then finally, in terms of the way their own journalists themselves cover protests, really implementing safety protocols for all of their journalists and media houses so that they can do so safely. So those are some of the broad thrusts under the global campaign that we're putting forward. And you can see how there's a number of touch points between those global calls and some of the actions that have been used to stigmatize and to criminalize protesters that we've seen in Poland.
Thanks, Quinn. Anya, now can we hope that Poland will reach these international human rights standards regarding the right to protest in the future? What do you think? What can we expect in the upcoming months or even years when it comes to the right to protest? And given that what we've mentioned already, that the election is coming, so what's your opinion about the future?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, that's an open question. So I hope that the human rights organizations, including Article 19 and also other countries in the European Union and the Council of Europe, will put peer pressure on Poland to improve in general human rights standards, including the standards on freedom of assembly and freedom of expression, what we translate to the right to protest. I would see that there are some political and social factors. So I would see that the state crackdown on protests could be especially dangerous in the context characterized by governing populists, because populism feeds on polarization, and populist leaders are enacting laws that are trying to mobilize parts of population, parts of society, and they are pitting various groups against each other. And this is what we've been going through in Poland. So this creates this atmosphere where, yes, people are more eager to, for instance, participate in elections. So turnout in Poland has increased in the past 10 years. But on the other hand, they also feel that they need to clash with fellow countrymen, right, and women. And this creates this atmosphere where protests can break out, especially when there is a big difference between achieved levels of equality of minorities or vulnerable groups in Poland compared to the peer group, so other states in Central Eastern Europe that are in the Council of Europe in the European Union as well. So I would say that we definitely need more friendly pressure, friendly monitoring, I would say assistance, reminders that such standards exist and that Poland is expected to uphold them, and also oftentimes in the public debate, the current need to help the Polish government because of the role that Poland plays as a country that is instrumental in helping Ukraine. I would say that we should always try to make separate, disjoin the two things. One is Poland's record, sometimes good record on human rights and humanitarian aid, and on the other, its broader democratic decline that is ongoing, that is actually, you know, it's been here for 8 years, and so some things are entrenched. So I think Poland also needs a lot of internal changes. It needs to get back on track their judiciary system, implement court judgments from the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice of the European Union. It just needs to be more in line with the standards that actually Poland some time ago has already achieved in certain aspects and areas, and now we are seeing that there is this deterioration, right? So but I feel it's not particularly Polish problem. So as you mentioned, this is a really great research project that sees those trends happening, those limitations to the right to express themselves in public, especially put against certain vulnerable groups that are maybe not that popular. And I feel that this is, of course, exacerbated in those countries that are governed by populists, because populists want to be popular. And to be popular is to galvanize your supporters. And they don't shy away from vilifying unpopular, let's say, minorities. But on the other hand, I would say I'm hopeful in the long term in Poland in relation to the rights of minorities and women, because according to all available social polling that it's here, well, younger generation is more open to the expansion of rights of various groups. And although it has an experience of living in a flawed democracy, the support for democracy is quite high. So my personal wish would be that we will go through this period of democratic decline to understand why do we want these rules in the first place. And maybe before we thought that, well, it's just how democracies work, okay. But when you actually live through a phase that lacks these certain guarantees, checks and balances, good European standards on civil and political rights, etc., then you can really see why they were introduced in our constitution and in the law, in international human rights law in the first place.
Thank you. Joanna, I have a question about, in relation to what you mentioned about the solidarity that you felt, you felt empowered by the solidarity from other people. How do you think how the situation will look like in the future? I'm asking because I hear more and more voices saying that, oh, I've been actively protesting all these years, but nothing is changing. It's tiring. It's just difficult to continue. And some people just decide to to stop going out, and there is a certain risk related to that. But perhaps it doesn't look that bad. Perhaps that's just the minority of such voices. I would like to hear your opinion about that. What do you think? How this will continue?
Mm-hmm. I don't think that there is one clear answer for this question. I have the same observations as you have, so that some people have burned out and given up activism altogether, but some pursue more behind the scenes or advocates in non-governmental organizations. Some of them operate on other fields, which may not be so spectacular and media visible and easily visible in media, but they deal with, for example, direct assistance to excluded people, or preparing to monitoring the election process, which is very important, especially this year. Behind many of us, there are a lot of trials that we want to close over those years. So for me, it's not anything surprising that we have a lot of burned out activists in Poland right now. But what has definitely remained after all those years of protests in Poland is the fact that social awareness, this is what Anna also mentioned, that social awareness has increased in terms of women's rights, right and access to abortion, LGBTQI plus people rights, and recently, after the death of Dorota from Nowy Targ in Poland, for those who don't know this situation, Dorota was pregnant and she went to the hospital in the Polish city of Nowy Targ, and the doctors didn't provide legal abortion for her, but they could and they should do it. So she died in 3 days in the hospital for sepsis. So after this, after media were speaking and writing a lot about this case, that was really huge case, not only in Poland, but I know that it was a lot of international media also seen this case. Around 60 protests took place all over the Poland in June. So I think this is really a lot. And that were the protests against such treatment of women and patients, against gynecological and obstetric violence, but also against the government anti-women policy. It's terrible that we still have to protest about such things, but at the same time, I think it's good that there are still many people that are involved in that. And I think that speaking about future, of course, a lot depends on the autumn elections somehow, but also on the course of election campaign, seeing this more in this short-term perspective. And I'm sure that we can expect, as I said before, we can expect smear campaigns against migrants and LGBTQI plus people. So we have to be, as activists and as engaged society, we have to be sensitive for that and ready to respond and ready to protest, because if there will be such smear campaigns, we have to react for that. We just can't stay and ignore it and look like nothing happened. And what maybe I want to say for the end of this part, we must remember that once won rights can be lost, and that there are that not any right that is given to us is not given forever. So we must protect them on one hand, but also on the other hand, we have to try to fight for new rights. We have to try to, we've got to try to expand this human rights sphere. And we have to remember that no one will give those rights to us, and we just have to fight for them. No one will give it for us. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. There is one question from the audience that I will read now. Do you think there is value in comparative academic engagement of similar protesting cultures around the world? If the pattern of oppressive democracies is so common across the world, could protesting mechanism and organization be compared and adopted effectively using academic engagement? Also, would there be value in comparative legal engagement on how to petition against oppressive laws, and would this aid on ground protests? Is anyone willing to answer this question?
I could just answer it really quickly, and then from our perspective in Article 19 on this, one of the things that we've seen around the world, and the question touches on, is the idea that authoritarian techniques and autocratization techniques have a bit of viralness around them, that authoritarian countries learn from each other. And so I actually quite like the idea of, well, should solidarity movements be trying to learn from each other? And what are the tactics that are actually successful? And can we be having kind of the positive flip side on that? I know there's a couple of different research initiatives I've seen at the NGO level that's tried to do that, but nothing kind of globally comprehensive in terms of an academic study that I've seen. Maybe I just haven't seen them. So it seems like that might be a very welcome addition in terms of trying to learn. The key thing would be it can't just stay academic. I think some of the things that we see is that there's some really interesting academic research that stays in kind of the university or think tank level, but doesn't actually filter down into the activist level. And so that would be one of the challenges just to be aware of on that. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't see more questions from the audience, so I would like to thank you, thank everyone for your interventions and contribution. I feel after this 1 hour that there is still a lot of energy and strength, and that this movement, protest movement and activism in Poland is it's only getting stronger despite all the obstacles. And I think that especially the word solidarity is key here, and I think that in Poland this is something of a long tradition to support each other against repression, and also among different groups. So we've seen that in the recent years that people were protesting against repression that targeting certain groups, even if they were not part of the group themselves. So this solidarity has been widespread, and I agree with what you said, that people have also learned a lot about why our rights, our fundamental rights are important, and that they cannot be taken for granted. We will see what next couple of months will bring. Surely Poland is a place to watch, and especially in autumn. So I'm sure that we will have lots of things to watch and to add when it comes to the fight for everyone to have the right to protest, and more broadly the right to freely express themselves. Once again, thank you very much, and all the best to you and to your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.